we're live.
Welcome. This is the Village of Gulf Manor Executive Committee meeting, 6 o'clock on Monday, March 13th. Mr. Prindoff, may I have a call to order and roll call, please?
Absolutely. One moment, here we go. That's regular minutes, sorry. Here we go. Mr. Fisher is absent. Mr. Knipp is absent. Mr. Marks?
Here.
Mr. Michelson?
Here.
Mr. Simile?
Here.
Mr. Van Horn?
Here.
We have a quorum.
Yep, I have a quorum. Mr. Knipp did contact me. He has a personal issue going on. He hopes to be here, but he did notify me. So, yes, motion to excuse Mr. Knipp.
Motion to excuse Mr.
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
And Mr. Fisher, motion to excuse Mr. Fisher.
Motion to excuse. Is it okay? I mean, did he let us know he wasn't going to be
I
here?
haven't heard. He's usually late.
Is it protocol that somebody should let us know they're not going to be here, or we just excuse them?
I would think that
Kind of.
we should be notified in advance of an
I
absence.
would think so.
Has anybody heard
That
from
doesn't
Mr.
always
Fisher?
happen. I'll make a motion to excuse. He's got like 6 or 8 kids. Something like that, yeah.
That's probably him right now.
Probably, yeah.
So
Let's see if this-
that may not be necessary, that
Count
second.
to 5.
That's
Yep,
it.
there you go.
Oh,
So we'll just delete
just as
that.
we excuse you.
Well, we were debating, to be honest.
Oh, boy.
Please excuse me.
So we can move on to the agenda, adopting the agenda?
Did we make a modification to the agenda?
Yes, the first thing is the police captain position is on the agenda tonight. And then Ron and I talked about it, there is a little bit of news regarding the landlord tenant legislation. And I know that also Mr. Butler was supposed to be doing some work, but I haven't heard anything. And Ron hadn't either, whether he had done anything on it yet.
Yeah, I
Still
know
hasn't-
he's not prepared to speak on that this evening. So.
Okay, well, that was in the minutes of the council meeting.
I do have a couple things that just information on that, so we can talk about that a little bit.
Okay.
And then,
I'm sorry, are you adding to the agenda?
yeah, just another note about the landlord tenant legislation.
So I have that under pending items, we can
Right.
address that
That's
when we get
okay,
there.
yeah, it's just, you can leave it
Okay.
as pending because we're not.
Okay.
But I'm saying you can address that when we get to that line item, unless you want me to move that to old business.
I would just address it as pending.
Yeah,
Okay, that's
There's
fine.
nothing definite.
So do we,
Yeah.
are there any official changes we need to make?
maybe when Mr. Butler has something to present, we'll move it on to.
Motion to approve the agenda.
Okay,
business.
that's a motion by Mr. Marks, need a second?
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Okay, we have no one registered to speak tonight. And I trust everybody reviewed the minutes.
Yes.
Motion
Any
to approve.
changes or?
Sorry.
Any
Motion to
changes or
approve
additions?
minutes.
I did not see anything. All second.
So. did you-
I made a motion to
Okay,
approve.
you seconded it? Okay, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Okay, minutes have been approved. Okay, there's been a lot of work, again, with the police department, kind of doing their new efforts and restructuring, or whatever you want to call it. And presented today was a new position, a captain position. I sent everybody a copy of the draft of it. I don't know if you had a chance to review it or not.
Yes, it's been online.
Okay. So that's what we're here to discuss first and see if we can make a recommendation to council on this one tonight, so.
So, just a quick question, so the captain's gonna report directly to you?
Correct.
Okay. And then, who goes underneath that, sergeant? or
Lieutenant.
Lieutenant, then
Sergeant.
sergeant, then corporal.
Corporal.
Okay.
Depending on
on the needs of the department, staffing situations, there may be periods in the PD's operation that all of those positions aren't filled, but we want those steps in place just for good linear progression for our officers. An example would be if the sergeant's position is vacated in the next month, it doesn't mean we'll immediately fill it, because we will have a brand new corporal. We want that officer to be able to grow in that role before we push him to that next step.
So if you recall from the study that was done in 2019, one of the vulnerabilities that it noted was that we were light on administrative help in the police department. Everybody, for the most part, was patrolling. So there's kind of a distinction between a patrol supervisor and someone who's doing the administrative kinds of stuff. So this will be additional help to help the chief make sure that there's coverage at the top of the department when there are issues that take place or during vacations and so forth. The other thing that we're trying to do is to build in succession planning into the department. We've done that with the with the corporal position. This would be another step for us to start planning for the future for when and if Chief Campbell would like to retire someday. That being the case, this would be a pretty significant move for someone to go into this position. So we do have somebody who would be a candidate, and I would like to go through the same procedure we did with the corporal. To have an interview process or a discussion process is probably more descriptive of it. Because I think we want to feel comfortable in terms of somebody elevating to this kind of position, because essentially they become the number 2 in the department. So this is considered a best practice. Again, it does fit within our budget. Mr. Pridnoff and I and the chief met this afternoon to talk about how this fits within our current structure of pay grades and so forth, and it's doable. It is a change for us, which is why we bring this to the executive committee for discussion. And I know that Chief Campbell, you can speak more eloquently regarding the pluses to having this position in the department.
I'll try to be eloquent. There's what we're finding is there's always challenges in patrol. These are kind of transactional things where we make contact, we deal with the run, we do the necessary paperwork and finish it. That's always there, but what we're finding is there's more and more behind the scenes administrative need. Where we find ourselves, me and Sergeant Reed and Forrest, pulled off the road to deal with a lot of, I have 2 pending investigative kind of, pulling of documents and things like that for like public records requests. There's a lot of these things that are becoming more and more common. Where in the past, our job was mainly out on the road. We're finding more reporting, more policy work, things like that. It helps greatly to have somebody available to work on a long-term project that doesn't have to run out the door every time the radio goes off. Like Ron said, it's very helpful when when I'm away to have a choice of where who's gonna take responsibility for that period of time. Sure. I like to rotate it because I like to share the joy. But it and again, it gives officers coming into our department a path that there's a future here beyond learning patrol and then going to a bigger agency. They can see that there's corporal positions, sergeant positions, lieutenant captain. They can see canine opportunities, task force opportunities. It just makes the department more marketable and more competitive with some of the larger agencies.
So I was sort of looking through this earlier. I think a lot of this looks like the outline for the recent corporal description, except for some changes, obviously, for command. Is that a reasonable explanation for this, the write-up?
Yeah, we could type, you remember from the fire department, it's infinite duties that
Sure.
come in front of you. So we could just scroll a never-ending document of what we would work on. We try to kind of find, the main things. The similarities are on purpose because we want somebody, corporal sergeant, to kind of see the types of tasks that are in front of them down the road if they choose to take those steps. The higher you get, the more entrenched you are with those responsibilities. You might lead a project, but not necessarily do it all. You can share the responsibility with somebody within that rank structure or patrol as well.
Can you sort of, just for people who haven't been here much, address who the individuals that have some of these titles today in the department, other than you?
Yeah. So Lieutenant Forrest is a patrol lieutenant. He's the canine handler as well. So a lot of his time is spent dealing with maintaining the canine certifications and the day-to-day training. It definitely taxes his ability to do a lot of the longer-term administrative work. Sergeant Reed has been putting in a lot of work for that in that area, and he's been his career is trending towards this. He's currently in PELC, which is Police Executive Leadership College. He's finished his last week of that this week. Graduates at the end of the month, so he's a natural fit for this progression. And then Officer Blanton will be promoted, sworn in as corporal tonight.
Okay.
And then Chad Woodford is a lieutenant. He's assigned to the task force only. He has his only administrative duties are his own, making sure his investigations are tight and correct and everything's prepared for court.
Okay, thanks.
You mentioned all these leadership positions might not be filled at any particular time. Is the current plan to fill this position or leave it open?
This position we would fill. Sergeant Reed makes the most sense. He's who I've been looking at this for a long time now. He's, like I said, he's in training to prepare for this role. He and I have completed a lot of the same training. It helps kind of sync philosophies. So he would fill that spot. There would be no hurry to fill the sergeant spot because the corporal was getting promoted this evening. So we want to allow Corporal Blanton to grow in his, in that role. Get familiar with it before we look at that next step. And the hope would be is somebody else may become eligible and express interest in becoming a corporal as well. I've said in the past I'd like to have a pool because somebody might feel comfortable in a corporal role where they're leading their shift or coworkers, but they don't want the larger overarching projects. But somebody in the corporal role, somebody else might want to take that next step. So we want to have that flexibility within the police department.
Thanks.
Would the captain be out at all, or just
Say that again?
would the captain be out on patrol at all?
Some to fill in when there's a need based on vacations, training, injuries, illness, but that would not be their primary. I mean, I've filled in on the road. It's not ideal because if you get involved in major incidents, then the leadership is tied up. It makes it difficult to do reviews and things like that. So he would be available, but he wouldn't be a primary patrol officer. He would be there in a support role or filling in if we had nobody available.
So excuse me, my understanding, it's the evening congestion thing. The rotations of the schedules will continue. So currently you have 2 in the day, 2 at night. Reed would come out of that rotation, but during the day, it would be like when you're here, if something is happening out on the road or if there's a planned absence, Reed would fill in on that schedule based on basically the same thing that you do at this point.
Yeah, it gives us a lot of flexibility, because, it gives him the ability, he's not tied to filling a shift. So if we want to, come in and support night shift or, just supplement them, have a full night shift, but come in and work with them and, work through the issues that are different than what's happening in the daytime. That's there as well without having to move pieces of the schedule around. The overlap helps tremendously.
Well, I just think this sounds like a natural progression for the department. They have these designated staff titles because we want to hang on to everybody we can, and I think that Gulf Manor has a good reputation, and if we have that, as you know, that's part of this, right? We want to attract and keep people, and that's the way to do it. A lot of people don't want to work for a Cincinnati or a Fairfield or some big place, like, they want to work in the department where they're known, so.
Yeah, there's there's all types out there. We just want to be able to offer as much as we can. Like I said, when I started, there was a chief, there was 2 supervisors, and there were only 3 full-time officers. And that was what you had in front of you. That was it. I was fortunate to work for a really good chief that exposed us to developing policies and things like that when you weren't in these formal roles. And this just kind of normalizes it, gives natural progression, experience for these guys.
Who's chief?
Tilly.
Chief, do you want, and it might be helpful, there are 2 specific programs that you and Reed have worked on in the last 6 months. One is the STEP program. The other is the Enhanced Community-Oriented Policing Program, where we're knocking on doors. I've heard a little bit about the second one in the last week or so. You want to talk a little bit more about how Reed is facilitating those 2 specific programs at this point?
Yeah, so we had, discussions on how to, I'll address the STEP program first, how to increase the traffic patrols, because there's, I know, when our officer that's responsible for investigations, if they take a family type assault run, they're tied up for most of their shift. So we basically brought back a program. We bring an officer in who's, if there's 2 people assigned to that shift, this person comes in, it's a 3rd officer. Their responsibility is just traffic enforcement. If a major incident happened, they would respond, but they're not going to take reports or go to calls or do anything other than traffic-related activities. We're seeing the results of it as positive. I'd like to get more people involved, and I think they will as the weather breaks. Not everybody wants to run around in the snow. And they don't have to, but as the weather breaks, we'll see that grow. And the other one is we want the officers to know the residents and interact a lot more because some of the concerns brought to us. Speaking from my experience and what I observe is officers do that, but we wanted to create a way where we can kind of standardize it and make it more reportable. Because a lot of problems we have in communicating with this body is collecting our data and reporting it. Because things go to one call, they turn into 5 different things. I'm kind of famous for going and helping an officer on a run and then wandering off because I see somebody talking to me on a porch. And we want those contacts, but we want people to, make that a focus of what they do. So Sergeant Reed worked on this and basically assigning areas to each officer to make sure they make contact. Find out what neighbors' concerns are, what they see, what they'd like to see more of, what they can, get from the police department. The officers seem to be enjoying it. Most of them have been doing this anyway. Now they can kind of take credit for it. So that's one of the things we've been working on. Some other things we'll see is we've been certified as a partner for the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. We're a former partner of theirs. We completed a lot of training, had the officers do that. I think we were just posted on their website yesterday. We should be receiving some recognition here in the next month. I hope to bring that to council. And then there's a police to peace training that we had the officers all conduct, which was received pretty positively. So there's a lot of things that we're working on.
Good.
Aside from responding and telling people to knock it off.
Yeah, okay. Well, excellent.
Is it, would it be possible to have somebody present to us kind of this plan and what it's gonna look like and laid out? Because I also think that we should be celebrating this, communicating with the neighbors in other ways. And then, to be honest, I'm excited about the police and peace concept. And I think it's something that really is a moniker for Gulf Manor.
Yeah,
To put out there.
and I don't want to diminish it at all, but the thing I learned in doing this training is this has been our philosophy all along. And completing these trainings and putting a name to the concepts and putting a name to the things that I've been doing my whole career. It was kind of rewarding to see that. It's, this isn't a huge change. This is what we've always been doing. I'll work with Sergeant Reed on that when he's back from training, and we can look into what we are able to present. I know there's some notices we could put out. We can coordinate with Ron.
So there was a press release packet that he sent me last week regarding the exploited children training.
Yeah.
And I wanted to run that past Mr. Butler first, considering the other issue that we have
Right,
going, just to make sure that we weren't fanning flames of some sort. But I think that's doing a press release to the general media about that is probably a good thing. It'll get some good press for us. I also have encouraged the police department to make use of the blog on the website. I mean, there's better ways that we can be using social media for the police department too. And I think that is part of some of Lieutenant Forrest's, my understanding is that we're transitioning him to do more social media kinds of stuff. I think we're kind of in the middle of work on that at the moment.
There's a lot of things. We have a lot of plates spinning at the same time. So adding this position helps with all of these initiatives.
Sure. Okay. Well, I don't know, do we need to make a recommendation on, I would fully support adding the captain position for police departments. If I need to make a motion, I will. Make a motion, we move this to council.
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, motion passes. Thank you, Chief. Okay, regarding the landlord tenant legislation, Mr. Butler was working on it, I guess, but we hadn't heard anything. There's nothing ready to present. So, but I did personally, over the last really year, when I just happened to run into landlords in Gulf Manor. And I happened to talk to another one this week. I didn't know it was just through his other avenue. And he owns 3 or 4 properties here in the village. And he had heard about kind of the rumblings of this going on. So I asked him, I said, we're looking for people to get involved in helping us put this legislation together because we want to make it work for everybody. So again, I was stimulated to think maybe we should, I know we talked about it, having the, getting a town hall meeting or some kind of event together with the landlords that we can to have just an honest discussion. Say, this is where we're coming from, what do you guys think or need, or how can we do this? I think it'd be healthy opportunity to, one, make it happen, and have it accepted, but also, move us forward. So is that something that community engagement would do, or we would do, or how would that?
So I think there's value in finding out, trying to get feedback from residents who are renting here in terms of what their perception of renting, what that's like in Gulf Manor. And there was a 10-question Survey Monkey, I believe, that was created 4 or 5 years ago that never was used because we were kind of not sure where we were going with this. I think it would be a good idea to dust that off and take a look at sending that out. At the time, not as many people were online, and there was discussion about whether or not to mail it, whether or not to make it online, whether or not to do whatever. I think getting that feedback kind of gives us a basis of what kind of problem do we have, if we have a problem, or to identify where there are opportunities that we can improve things. I understood at the time when we were talking about that a lot of the landlords weren't in favor of that because they thought that we might uncover negative things. But I think it's a communication issue between the village and its residents, and I think it would be good information to have. The other thing that I think would be helpful is if we have a task force or one more committee to talk about what kinds of changes need to be made with our relationship with landlords and what requirements need to be placed on them. One of the problems with the legislation that was done in 2016, whenever 2015 or 16, whenever that was, is they waited until the last minute to involve the landlords. And then there was a landlord uprising and it just kind of all fizzled out. And I think had we reached out to the apartment association and had talked to a couple of landlords in the village who had good reputations for managing their properties, we might have gotten further with the whole situation. But I think that's kind of tells us, I think, how we need to how do we need to attack this going forward. In speaking with Mr. Donald and Mr. Butler, the legislature has not put any controls on this kind of stuff yet. And what we can do, particularly with Airbnbs, is if council wishes to control that or to have some guidelines on those kinds of rentals, likely, possibly, maybe, the state legislature will allow a grandfathering of what communities are already doing when and if they decide to put those kinds of rules in place on a statewide basis. But I've not seen in the agendas that the Ohio Municipal League has put up that they're even discussing it at this point. So this may be a good time for us to start considering these kinds of issues. But I think we have to prioritize exactly where we're going with this particular issue. And I think starting with the residents is probably a good place.
When council last time, that's the reason it was brought up that Mr. Butler tentatively would bring something to executive tonight, sort of an outline of a tenant landlord type legislation.
Yeah, he's not prepared
And
for
he's
that.
not prepared for that, but I think that's one step, right? Now, the survey you're talking about, now that we have a community engagement, does that fall under them?
Probably.
Sounds like it.
In fact, what I think makes sense to do, let me find that survey and I'll send that out to the council members so you guys can review it and kind of become familiar with what was on it. It wasn't an in-depth deep kind of thing, but it did ask some questions about how do you feel about your landlord? Are they responsive, or do you think your rental property is a good value? That might have been a push. I can't remember exactly what was on there, but it also stated if you have a problem, how quickly do they get back to you? Or do you have outstanding issues that have been, 30 days, 90 days, more than 120 days? And I think that's the kind of information that we would like to know, especially from a safety and health standpoint. Some of the properties where we know there is blight, particularly on Stover Avenue, having that kind of information would help us ferret out some of that. And now that Jill Matthews is helping Mr. Putoff with the code enforcement, I feel like we can start taking on some of these additional things now.
It seems to me like, can we make a distinction between like long-term rental and then the short-term, which would be
Sure.
Airbnb?
Yes.
Because they're very different.
Yeah.
And, my anecdotal sense is that a lot of Airbnbs are fixed up pretty nice because they're like hotels and, they're usually pretty well kept, whereas rental properties can be all over the board. And then,
But a lot of communities now are putting together Airbnb type ordinances.
right,
Just targeting short-term rentals.
right. So and that sounds like the one that's more at play with the state. Is that right? The Airbnb issue? So if we focus on the long term, I think we'll be, if the state does any changes, we're probably less likely to.
Well, I believe the police department has had some encounters with Airbnbs. And I don't know if you want to speak to what some of the problems that you've run into have been.
Yeah, there's a block of them here in the village, and we were taking frequent criminal reports for thefts and burglaries where codes were accessible to former employees or agents of the Airbnbs, and people were having property of theirs taken or stolen. And the issue came about because somebody would be here in town for like a 30-day window. We were having trouble prosecuting these individuals because the people weren't in town long enough to do it. So people were basically being victimized, and then they were victimized again because they had to go back, to their primary residences and weren't able to help us, through the court procedures. It got to, there was one point where we were taking 2 or 3 reports a week for the same group of properties owned by the same individual.
So what's the magnitude that we know of today? Are we talking a half a dozen Airbnb properties or 3 dozen or 50?
I don't know. I've not searched it. I think we could do a search and find out. The one was a group of efficiencies, so I think that owner owns, I think it's 5 buildings, so it could be potentially 20 units. I don't think that they're all Airbnbs. But we know there was a cluster of them, and we were taking reports from somebody that was hired to clean out a unit, had a door code, and they can just come back. So yeah.
Chief, are these single family or multi-family units?
Multifamily, 4 units per building.
Okay.
And I mean, when I'm talking about the frustration of not being able to prosecute in court is victims had camera footage of the person walking out with their property, but they had to go back to Chicago or another city where they were from and couldn't be here for that prosecution.
So just as a quick reference, there are 7 active listings for Airbnb in the village by different people.
Okay.
There's a cluster, it looks like, and then there's 2 or 3 different, one's a home, 2 are just rooms in a house, and
What streets? Doesn't show that.
Yeah, they'll be all.
The one on Stover, one on Elbrook, one on Hamel. And then there's a cluster, looks like around Los Angeles and Fair Oaks. And on Vera.
That's the one you talked about.
Would it be handled differently if,
Vera?
would it be handled differently if
Not sure.
someone's just renting a room in their house compared to having a dedicated rental unit?
Criminals are criminals.
Yeah, I couldn't speak to that. I mean, we don't engage in any kind of landlord licensing other than we can enforce an ordinance where landlords have to report their tenants to the tax authority. So years ago, I came across this ordinance because it's not in the typical criminal section. It's Section 7 of our ordinances. And I used it quite a bit when we had troubled landlords and we dealt with like a family or a situation repeatedly. I could say that we were at this apartment dealing with this individual on January 1st. And we went back 4 times since then. And now today it's March 13th and that person's not been reported. You have 30 days to report. So I would cite that landlord for that individual. And what I found was once the landlord got a citation for that, we got a flood of, they might have owned 3 or 4 other properties in the village we didn't know about. And so now here comes tenants and 4 units here, 4 units here, 4 units here. So I think that ordinance helped us. But as far as rentals of rooms, we have a couple situations like that. Ones I could think of were on Vera. You put people in an apartment together, their personalities could clash. We could have instances, but as far as managing that, I would leave that to council and to our owner.
I'm familiar that some of the state legislation, what specifically they're looking at is that these are businesses that aren't necessarily registered anywhere, and so that there's tax revenue that isn't being generated. So I know the state is, that's a big concern of theirs. I know with our discussions about having landlords, register that that they have apartment buildings and everything, that there could be a piece of that as well. But I was going to ask the administration, because the administration has shared with me that issue of businesses around the community that aren't necessarily registered, and that this kind of legislation may speak to our ability to kind of call them in on those kind of issues. Can you speak to that?
I'm sorry.
The issue about B&Bs potentially not paying taxes if we don't even know that they're there.
Yeah, that's so as a chartered community, I'm trying to think how to state this. There's a feeling I own my property. I can do with my property whatever I want to do with it. Understood. But if I decide to rent my house, essentially I'm conducting business in the village of Gulf Manor by doing that. So as a chartered community, we have the ability to regulate business that takes place in our community. That's part of our charter. So when we have landlords, and we heard this previously when we went through this trying to control the landlords thing, people came back to us and said, how can you do this? This is my property. I'll do with my property what I want to do with my property. Well, the guy running the bakery across the street could say the same thing too, but there are still health codes and regulations through the state and through the county that you have to follow. We also have a situation where somebody's running an Airbnb for cars in the village illegally. We have the right to know what businesses are taking place. And then part of that, as the mayor mentioned, is we have a right to that tax money, to that, because that's what makes our village run. So where someone is renting their home or is running a business such as an Airbnb for cars, which is kind of a weird thing, you're using village streets, village resources, village parking, you're inconveniencing other people potentially with your stock sitting around on our streets and so forth. We have to be in a position to be able to control those kinds of things. So it makes sense that before this whole Airbnb thing just kind of blossoms and gets out of control, and we have 100 to control, we know it's becoming an issue. We know that we're spending resources that, resources for the police department are planting around trees. We have to, we wish it did, but we have to be in a position that we can wisely use the dollars that have been allocated. And that's one of the things that council has the ability to do, is to keep watch on these kinds of things. My point of view is I welcome any business that wants to come here and do business. We want your tax dollars to keep the village running, but you have to do it legally. And we will do whatever we can to foster positive business growth in the village. We just have to know what you're doing. So, and it's not that we want to run it for you or anything like that. It's just we have a right to know, because it's for the greater good of everybody who lives here.
So I guess where we're at now is getting guidance from Mr. Butler about how we can proceed, or the best way to proceed with both of these.
So why don't let me find that survey. Let me get that to you guys. Why don't we put on the agenda for the next executive committee meeting? And I don't think there will be an opportunity to talk about this in community engagement. That agenda is like overflowing at the moment. But let's try to be in a position at the next meeting. And I think Eric's making a note here for that, to discuss the survey, which will help us remember to talk about it.
Okay.
Well, it seems to me that this has really come about because of, one, I've heard of some horrible rental situations for people, and we don't want residents to have to suffer through that. Some of it is just the issues that come with the rental property sometimes. And if it's taking resources of our police beyond, what it should, it's fair to tax it on some reason, on some level of support. That's what taxes are kind of for, is to help to cause change or influence, right? So I can go that far to support that effort. But part of me thinks that we could go ahead, I think, and try to talk to the landlords now, alongside reaching out to the residents, and tell them that the survey is going to happen, with the residents, and just start the ball rolling, and not just wait till we get this information and then kind of throw it on them, depending on what it says. Because I think the landlords, at least the ones I've talked to, not the ones you've talked to, I'm sure, but the ones I've talked to, they're concerned, but they seem to generally care about their properties up to a certain point, and they also care that Gulf Manor, they're going to come in and inspect, and they're going to make my rents go up because they're going to charge me. They're going to, those are real concerns to them, and I don't know if there's a way to work. I want to talk to them about it, tell them where we're coming from. The guy I talked to this week, I told him where this comes from in our village, in terms of some of the rental properties we've had issues with. And I said, this is what spawned this whole discussion with this. And he kind of got it, but he kind of doesn't sound like, I'm not one of those. I take care of my properties, So.
But we don't know that, right?
Well, from what he told me, he knows what he's doing. I want to tell you everything because it was our discussion, but he definitely knows what he's doing, so.
Well, it sounds like we're on for the next meeting to discuss this further.
Okay, so we're gonna continue to wait for Mr. Butler to.
Well, I think
something.
let's have a discussion with him, find out where he is
Okay.
on this. Because I know we've been working a couple of other issues which have kind of preoccupied his time over this, so.
Okay. Is it fair to say we're gonna work on long-term rentals more than Airbnbs right now? I mean, it's gonna fall over to it, but, because they do seem like two different issues, and the state might be more influencing the Airbnb portion than,
My only caution would be, I think talking to the landlords is a great idea, but I think we need to be selective how we do that. Because when this happened several years back, it was kind of a cattle call to, oh my gosh, look what we're doing, and it just, things kind of blew up. I know that there are some relationships I know Mr. Putoff has with some of the rental property owners. So, if we can identify 2 or 3 people that can kind of speak for the group, which is where we were headed the last time. In fact, we were starting to do this just before the pandemic. So I can't recall the guy's name, but he's the head of the apartment association in Greater Cincinnati. And they were working with the city of Cincinnati on similar legislation for the city. So let me see what I can find out about that, if they ever passed that. I don't recall having heard that. I know there's a lot of stuff going on with the city right now regarding landlords and tenants, but fortunately, we don't have that level of problem. Oh, look who it is, it's Mr. Butler. So.
well, I guess for me, it's partly just building a relationship with them as part of it.
I think that is part of it, and if you can get somebody who's well-connected, I know of one resident landlord who lives in his building, who I think should be a part of this discussion. I know there was a guy in Westchester who owns several properties here who was pretty on top of everything. Let me do some research and see if I can find those people again.
Okay.
So on the agenda for next meeting.
Okay. So that's the last thing for today on the agenda. I know we've got some more things coming up for the next meeting. But if there's nothing else.
Motion to adjourn.
So, the next executive committee meeting is on April 17th at 5:30. So we're doing 5:30, 6:30, and 7:30 meetings that night.
Okay.
In the month of April due to the holidays. So it'll be a jam-packed night.
There was a motion to adjourn by Mr. Marks, is that correct?
Second, right.
But it's still-
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Thank you, everyone.
Play ball. Play ball. I think you should be sitting like over there. I noticed you put some space in between.
Yeah.
You don't want him next to you.
You're hot.
You were wearing that jacket, I think. Holy crap.
Yeah, no. It got a little toasty.
How are you? All right.
Uh-oh. So, actually, I have something. Hey, Ron, real quick, did you see Malazzo vacated the properties?
Have they?
Yes,
Wait, they left their house.
they moved everything out.
Oh, I saw them doing cement work.
Yeah, they had a couple of moving trucks come up, and next thing, yeah, the ones at the corner.
So Sharon had mentioned that it looked like the house was empty.
Yeah, they moved out. Malaz.
Yeah.
Yeah, Malaz moved out like a couple of weeks ago.
Because they're doing construction without permit there.
Oh.
Yeah.
So Jim's following up on that.
Good. What a shock that they would do that.
Oh, actually,
We're offline, aren't we?
if you look at the auditor's
Ron,
side, they
are
bought a
we
very
offline?
expensive house.
Where at?
It's lovely.
Supposed to do that.
Go, Rick.
Exactly. Uh-huh. Yeah, very expensive, but they have a lot of
Hey,
rental
how are you?
properties.
How's Haven after her fall?
Oh, check it out.
Oh,
Oh,
we
look
just
on.
crossed each other in the school office.